Okay, so here we have our last video lecture of the year, very exciting. We are looking at evidence of evolution. And whenever you talk about evolution, it always brings up a number of issues or conflicts within students. Evolution is a topic that is discussed both in an academic sense in science classes, and also as a theoretical sense, or a theological sense, I'm sorry, in religious classes. And so what we need to do is we need to understand that evolution is a theory that is backed by science, and so that is why we talk about it in science class, and that is why it's the only theory that we talk about in science class. So just to sort of take a little of the pressure off, I like to start with a little joke here, a little Homer sapien, looking at the evolution, because obviously, a number of people, when they hear the word evolution, they immediately say, oh, yeah, that's because, we're cousins with monkeys. And we know that that's not a true statement. Okay? So, Darwin took a voyage on the Beagle. Here's the path of his voyage. We want to focus in right here. Here's the Galapagos Islands. That's where he made a number of his key observations, where he was able to put together his theory of natural selection, which influenced his overall theory of evolution. And evolution is the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. So in other words, we're looking at how populations have changed over periods of time. And notice that we go modern to ancient, so we're talking about long periods of time, not just, 10 years ago, not even, 500 or 1,000 years ago. We're talking about many, many, many generations. Okay. So the most important thing here, we want to look at what type of evidence for evolution is there to back up Darwin's theory. Because anytime that you make some sort of a claim, you need to support it with examples. So we're going to look at 4 different categories of evidence for evolution. The objective of this lecture would be to describe an example and explain how it supports the theory of evolution. So we'll go through each one of these 4 with an example. All right. So the first one, all right, the fossil record. Fossils, hopefully you've learned about those before, but a fossil is basically the preserved remains, or the preserved imprint of the remains of an organism that at one time existed on Earth. And so Darwin looked at these fossils and saw it sort of like as a record of the history of life on Earth. And he could do comparisons. All right, so here is, a wedge, or sort of a trans section of, let's say, the crust, okay? And when we look, we can see that there are all these different layers, okay? Over time, as more sediments piled on top, we have the oldest layer on the bottom, and we have the newest layer on the top. And so what you'll see here is that there are examples of organisms, and we can find their fossils in the oldest layers, but then we can look through geologic time as we move up each layer, and we can see how that organism changed in response to changing environments. Okay, and that is evidence of evolution. Okay, and this is just another picture of a fossil that we could find. Based on looking at that fossil, we can make some conclusions about the life of that organism. For example, we see 2 very large, sharp teeth that are accompanied on the sides and on the bottom by more sharp, pointy teeth. So we would conclude that this organism was indeed a carnivore. All right, the second piece of evidence. Okay, one of the organisms that Darwin studied were finches, and those were those birds that we talked about. And he decided that instead of all those finches being created separately as individual species, they all had originally descended from a common ancestor, and the ancestor was on the mainland of South America. But as they moved to different environments, they were put under different pressures. And so because of that, they developed different, different beak sizes or maybe different wing shape, things like that. Okay? You could say the reverse, however. You could say that organisms that are in similar environments would be pressured to develop similar types of characteristics, and that would be due again to natural selection. Okay. So what we're going to look at on the next page, we're going to see a group of organisms. There's no way they could have interbreeded with each other because of certain isolating mechanisms, mostly geographical isolating mechanisms. Their ranges do not overlap. Yet, these organisms are extremely similar due to the fact that they have very similar environments. Okay, so here's a diagram. Okay, all of these organisms, we can see they come from different areas. By doing genetic analysis, we know that they have not interbred with each other, so they are unrelated. Okay, but they live in very similar habitats, and you can see very similar characteristics. For example, they're all small, brown, furry, rodent-like organisms. They have short snouts. They have some form of a tail. Okay, he's got a tail too. They have short legs with, small webbed feet. Okay, all of these characteristics are due to the fact that they are found in similar environments. So again, the stress there is that even though they are unrelated, they have been acted upon through natural selection to have similar characteristics. So this has nothing to do with common ancestry. It's the exact opposite. That's what it's trying to show. Okay. Homologous body structures. We've seen this term homologous before. We know that it doesn't mean same or identical, but it means similar. The way that body structures are similar is that they have the same structure, but they have developed different functions. Okay, this is going to help us group organisms by how closely related they are. So homologous body structures will show organisms that have shared common ancestry. And we can find this when we look at the skeleton of the animal kingdom. Okay, so here's a great diagram. This is straight from your textbook. All right, we look at a turtle, an alligator, a bird, and a mammal, which I'm going to go with a horse or a deer of some sort. That is that because that looks like a hoof there. Okay, notice how each of the bones are color-coded. Okay, and we have 4 different organisms, and they all use this forearm, okay, or this limb, we could say, in a different way, right? Okay, turtles, they sort of, the way they walk is different from an alligator. Birds obviously use their limbs for flying, and mammals are going to use to walk, more in an upright position. But what do they have in common? That all of the bone structure comes from the same sort of mold in a way, right? We see they all have sort of this upper arm bone that we have, okay? And then down into here, the purple bones, we see that for 3 of them, they have 2 bones, just like we do. In the mammal, in the horse here, his bone has been fused together, but we still see that it's there, it's present, okay? Then where we have our wrist, that would be the next yellow bone here, okay? Here and here, we can see evidence of that, those small circular round bones, just like in your wrist. The red would be like the bones in your palm, and then the blue would be like the phalanges. And note, we don't all have the same number of phalanges, but yet we have bones representing those structures. And when we look back in evolutionary time, okay, the common ancestor of all four of these organisms is an ancient fish, and in that fish we find very rudimentary structures that make up those categories of bone. Okay, so again, here with homologous structures, the reason why it is supporting evolution is because showing that they have shared structure but very different functions is going to be a reason to say that they have a common ancestor. If the ability to fly is so different from the ability to walk, why on earth would you have the same bone structure? The only explanation for that is that your bone structure came from a common ancestor. Okay, so those are homologous structures. Sometimes we can also look at vestigial structures, and vestigial means organs or structures within the body that are so reduced in their size because they are so reduced in their function that they pretty much do not exist anymore. They have no function. But it's evidence that at one time they did have a function. For example, the human appendix. Okay, sitting off the bottom of your small intestine is a small structure there. From what we understand in earlier forms of human, it was actually much larger, and it was used to help digest raw meat. Okay, so what could have changed about us that would cause that appendix to no longer be useful? When's the last time you ate raw meat? Yeah, we don't, okay? So once we started cooking our food, in other words, once the advent of fire came about, we weren't needing the appendix to help break down those tough raw meat proteins anymore. And so over time it shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, and now your appendix plays absolutely no role whatsoever. In fact, most of the time it gets infected and gets in the way and has to be surgically removed. So this is an example of a vestigial organ, and this is an evidence for evolution because it shows how the organ was at one time used in an earlier ancestor, but as pressures in the environment have changed, it no longer has a function. Okay. All right, and the last, when we look at embryology, okay, in other words, studying the formation of embryos, there's an eerie similarity between groups of organisms that have evolved from one another and their embryo development. Okay, so here if we look at this, we're looking at the columns going straight down. Okay, we have three different organisms. Here we're looking at the embryo development of some sort of a reptile. Here we're looking at the embryo development of a chicken. And here we're looking at the embryo development of a pig. Okay, once we get into later stages of the development, okay, at this point, if I gave you a matching quiz with these three pictures, do you think you'd be able to match reptile, chicken, and egg? Probably, okay, but look at early development here, okay? In these earlier stages, look how similar the embryos look. And we know reptiles and chickens and pigs, they're going to, develop very differently after that. But the fact that they all start out the same, the fact that they all have very similar development, the way that their cells are going to reproduce, the way that their tissues are going to organize as the embryo develops, that points to the fact that they have shared common ancestry with one another. Okay? So I know that this was a rather short lecture. We're going to be doing an activity in class to reinforce. Again, the objective of this lecture was to go through the 4 key pieces of evidence for evolution, be able to describe an example, and explain how it supports the theory. For most of them, it was looking at shared common ancestry, okay, for the homologous structures, for the vestigial organs, and for embryology. All right. When we looked at geographic distribution, it was the opposite. It was trying to show that even though the organisms did not share a common ancestor, they evolved similar structures, okay, similar characteristics due to similar environmental pressures. And then going all the way back to the beginning, the last thing with the fossil record provides evidence of evolution because when we can look at organisms and their fossils that were trapped in older rock layers, and we can compare them to newer rock layers, and we can see how that organism has changed over time. Okay, if you have any questions, please email me or see me before or after school or in class.